started an engagement with a huge organization that gets very caught up in overly detailed, very elaborate manual test scripts. And, they're not the only organization like that, but the idea is to cut down on some of that. Like you said, you can't just replace all of your manual tests, but these are smart testers. They want to be good testers, and they get excited about doing good stuff. And just simply going through all of those repetitive regression tests every time you need to move from one environment to another or validate a feature. This is what I've been telling them. Look, we're going to automate stuff. We're going to change how you think about your manual testing, and you're going to get to do that fun stuff that you really wanted to be a tester for. For those of you along with the webinar, Liz Keogh is a great lady who has been central around BDD, behavior-driven development, and she's got a terrific blog post up there, Step Away from the Tools. And if you actually Google that, that's the first hit for Step Away from the Tools. And she talks about kind of stepping back and reassessing things at a higher level of why you want to go down this road and what you expect from it. I'd really encourage everybody to take 10 minutes or so and read that. She wrote that back in like 2011, but it's sort of timeless stuff.
Yeah, it's funny is I just found that post like a few weeks ago, and I thought she just wrote it because I was like reading, I'm like, this is totally very timely stuff, and then I saw the timestamp, and I was like, what? She wrote how long ago? Yeah,
it was like 4 years ago, but
yeah, great.
It's definitely some of that ageless stuff. So yeah, make sure before you jump into automation that you've got the right expectations about what you're going to get out of automation, and how you're going to roll into that and what problems you're trying to solve. So let's go ahead and we'll bump on to the next thing, which is the people that you'll need to do the work. If you can't get the right people and enable them and empower them and also expect them to kind of move into this in a smart fashion, things are going to go really, really poorly. To me, a lot of testers may not have a deep programming background. And so I'll call those folks non-technical testers. And it's not that they don't know technology. I just haven't figured out a better phrase. But, they don't have a deep programming background. And they get very intimidated that, oh, my gosh, you're going to ask me to use this tool where I have to write some code. I'm going to have to do some other things. And they get very intimidated. So encouraging those people that, wait a minute, the stuff we're going to show you how to do in test automation is dramatically different than like deep system level code. As a test automator, you're thinking about kind of guiding a browser or guiding the UI driver around to do certain things. And you don't have to worry about, multi-threaded, concurrent, JSONified web service, XML transactions that are thread pulled down. It's a different thing. And once you kind of walk people through that, you can get them excited and feeling like they've got the ability to do really effective work and focus on the testing areas. Dave, how do you approach the people that you're bringing into these sorts of efforts?
Yeah, well, it's a great topic just because I think it's something that's very, very prevalent nowadays because there's so many people that are kind of in a position where they feel that in order to stay relevant, they have to figure out how to become an automator. And some people are maybe voluntold to do it. But I think that what matters is just being excited about learning a new skill. And that's really the best way to look at it. Because when I first got into programming, I didn't have a development background very much. I had like an intro to programming class maybe that also scared the crap out of me in college. And so given that I've written 2 books on the subject, I think that it really there's a very small subset of programming that you need to know to become effective, and it's not that much. It's really like you need to know maybe 8 concepts, and they're all complementary of each other. They kind of build on themselves, and then once you show someone the first few examples and get them some early success, they have more than enough tools to go and start writing a small suite of tests. And then once they do that, then they're ready for the next phase. And then I think that there's very much an order of learning that works for teaching people that may be intimidated with the concepts. So it's more bite-sized versus when I started, there wasn't documentation that made it approachable like that. I'm basically like writing all this down so that I could, once I build a time machine, send it back to myself from 5 years ago. But short of that, I think that I think if you're just getting started with automation, knowing that it's not, you don't have to become like this world-class developer. You just have to know how to write a little bit of code and know kind of what those tools are, and then just have a working glossary of knowledge, which is very small.
You were very specific. You said 8 concepts, which I find interesting because I would have been very more abstract. In any of your books or your blog posts, have you kind of laid out what those 8? We don't need to run through them, right? I'm just wondering if you've written about that, and if not, I think that'd make an awesome blog post.
So this is like, I was very reluctant about writing about this before, but I realized that it was very imperative for a lot of the people that would, the likely person who would read my book, thinking about where I was when I started. If I was going to pick up this book, would it be useful? And one of the very early chapters, I have a version in Ruby and a version in Java, and they both have a chapter on it's called the Programming Primer. And in it, I basically think through everything I wrote about in the book. So I read this chapter last. I read like one of the first chapters in the book. I read it last. And I think about all the concepts I cover that words I use that I know I need to define early in the book. And when I'm done, I look at it and I'm like, I think that's just enough. I think that's there's more I could add. Obviously, I think there's like an infinite amount of material that can be written about this, but it's between something like 8 and 10 concepts depending on the language. But given that we deal with similar programming languages, at least the first 4 that come to mind, they all just really different. It's syntactic differences, and then maybe like the name of the tool changes, but the fundamental principles are the same. So the concepts are the same across these languages. So really, it's about 8 or 10. And I don't have a blog post yet because, like I said, I was reluctant when I first wrote about it, but I just wrote about it again. So I've done it for two programming languages, and so far it seems like it's well received. So maybe it's worth writing a blog post about it, just kind of more maybe abstracting the concepts. But it's a very small list. So hopefully that's helpful. That number maybe will resonate. And
well, it's an approachable number, right? Again, when you've got testers that are coming from a non-programming background, it helps cut down on some of the fear or angst or FUD that they may feel about moving into this. Like, look, you don't need to learn all this stuff. Here's 5 things. Here's 8 things. And you talking about those concepts being cross-platform is totally spot on. This engagement that I'm on now, they're actually working in Java with Eclipse, and I have not touched Java in probably 15 years. So I sat down like the second or third day after I got my system set up, and was pairing with somebody, and I was stumbling around like a complete idiot because I didn't know some of the syntax, I didn't know the libraries, but it's still the same thing. Look, we have to start up a browser. We're going to navigate someplace. We've got a little bit of asynchronous. So I think that's something else that's helpful. It's like you can talk to your people. Here's the problems that we solve, and let's not focus on the tools. It doesn't matter if you're using Test Studio that kind of gives you an environment to work with. It doesn't matter if you're writing Ruby or Java or .NET. Those concepts are much easier to get the hands around, and it helps encourage them that, look, a couple weeks of frustration of getting up the learning curve, you're going to have constant little wins, and in 2 weeks you're going to be moderately productive, and then there's just that long journey of getting to the place where you can master automation. Cool. So let's, one of the things that I'm always big on is, if you have the time, trying to carve out some type of a pilot or a prototype or a spike, but a period on the schedule where you can work with the folks to really kind of knock the rust out. And, you know, if your project is already underway and you don't have time for a formalized pilot that's a separate project, that's fine. But you need to set the expectations with your team that, look, we're going to take 2 weeks, you know, 1 iteration, 2 iterations. We need a set period of time where you're giving us the ability to just really stumble around in a directed stumbling fashion to learn how the tools work, to learn how the tools work in our system, because every tool works different on every project, but really understanding how to start learning to be very effective in that environment. How do you approach, Dave, when you get rolling on a project, kind of, you know, that first rush of time trying to get everybody effective?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of different ways. It really depends on if a company already has something or if they have nothing. If the company is just starting brand new, I think it goes back to those initial questions that I asked, which, you know, a large part of it has to do with understanding the business need to help focus on a small percentage of the app to test. So you know, like, what kind of functionality you're going to have to test. Like if it's a web app, for example, get like a handful of tests, like your first 5 automated tests under wraps, and don't really worry about it being perfect or scalable, but just try to get it working. And then once you have something, basically a straw man of automated tests, and you've kind of learned maybe the hard way to get some of these things, because certain apps are harder to test than others depending on how they're built. But once you get your first 5 tests, it's great. It's a great amount of success, and that little effort is actually a tremendous amount of experience, which will inform everything else you do next. Which, you know, then certain things will become obvious in hindsight that you'll then incorporate into the next bout of the next iteration of work that you do. So I think it's not just about setting expectations, right? It's like carving out, maybe that's part of the expectations, but carving out a space where you just have, the only constraint is really time. That way, and just you have encouragement to, like you said, stumble in a coordinated direction towards something reasonable. And then going from there, ultimately, like, you would find ways to make the system more testable. And that 4th bullet point, learn to make the system testable, is actually, it's a hard one. I think that maybe it's not obvious to people how to make a system testable unless they're the ones testing it.
Right.
And so I think that there's also, maybe part of this conversation could float around the concept of how involved the developers are in the automated testing as well.
That's a good point. And I don't think and I'm actually, and I just realized that on my deck, nowhere do I talk about kind of that whole team collaboration. But you're so right. If you have access to the developers, regardless of whether it's, you know, swivel your chair around and talk to the person behind you, or get them up on Skype or IM or even email, or God forbid the actual telephone, that collaboration is a huge factor in any successful project, because, you know, like you mentioned, the pages might be difficult. The developers can help you out with, for example, sprinkling IDs in good places. If you've got a lot of crazy async that's going on, the developers know the order that things are happening and the async actions that might not be important. They can even like set flag elements or give you events or hooks. That developer tie-in and involvement, if you don't have it, your odds of a successful UI automation project, I think, plummet. You can do it, but it's going to be a lot more painful than it has to be.
Yeah, that, and when it's done, it won't be maybe as reliable. I think that you save a
Sure.
lot of time as well just by, like, if there's something that you're stuck with and you go to a developer and you say, hey, I'm trying to do this, and they'll be like, oh, like to them it would be like a light bulb when you can show someone something
Yeah.
as opposed to describe it to them. Like, then they'll know exactly what you're trying to do, and they'll either, like you said, make something available, or maybe there's something already available, or they'll help you maybe think about the problem differently. And that's a tremendous resource if you have it.
It is. Bear with me, but I have one story from actually when I used to work at Tellert that perfectly illustrates this. I was working with a customer in Asian, and my direct contact was very frustrated because um, it looked like Test Studio was bug ridden and was not working with their particular scenario that they were trying to deal with. And it basically involved clicking a button and then moving on to another action. And you could see when the test was playing back that the button would get clicked because their UI actually had, a little UX piece there that made the button show that it had been clicked. But the actions weren't happening, and it was intermittent. And so we were thinking timing and all of this asynchronous stuff. But I kept saying, you need to talk with the developers because everything from this side that we can see from the front side, everything looks like it should be working. And this went on for honestly a year of frustration. And I went on site with that customer for a couple days, and we got to this one particular problem. And we had a meeting with the team that was responsible sort of for that functional slice. Their guys come in, we run back the test, and this is like 5 minutes after the meeting starts. We say hello, run back the test, see the problem, and one of the developer goes, oh, I bet the queue is locked to the UI. And I said, what queue? Tell me more about this locking. And what had happened was they had functionality that as events were in a certain state, they were actually blocking UI interactions. And we would never have been able to figure that out if that one guy, the one developer who owned that slice, hadn't been in the room.
Yeah. It's funny is that, all this boils down to it's, humans are building tools to be tested by humans using other tools. And it's just like kind of an arms race, and it definitely needs to be a collaborative exercise. And honestly, the companies I've seen that are the most successful are the ones that have tight integration with developers helping with test automation.
Yeah, it's the best, and it's very foreign to a lot of companies. Our culture as software delivery folks has not really traditionally been built up that way. So you've got some cultural walls to break down. There's geographic stuff. There's process things, but all of this, if you can carve out that time box to run that pilot, this is a great place to get started with that.
Yeah.
So once, I don't know, to me, I kind of block out sort of that pilot or that learning process a little bit separately from, okay, we've learned the initial hard lessons, now let's get rolling for real, and starting to really try to focus on delivering things. Pairing up here, actually that would have been where I was going to talk about developer collaboration, because to me, the more time you can spend working with either a developer or your BA, your business analysts, even if you have good access to them, the stakeholders or the product owners, or if you're so lucky, occasionally even pairing up with an end user to sort of walk through how that flow is supposed to go so you understand how the system's used, you get great things there. We've talked about maintainable tests a little bit, and then one of the things that I'm big on is building up backing APIs. For example, when you need to create test data, you shouldn't be using the UI to do that. You should be calling a library that you and the developers have built to leverage the system itself. I need to create a new purchase order. Fine, I've got an API that I can hit to do that very quickly. And then also for your heuristics or your test oracles, you do something at the UI, you need to validate that actually happened in the system itself. So you need to go talk to the database or or some queue somewhere or something. Um, what are the sorts of things as a project moves on? What do you kind of view helping out that longer real effort, Dave?
Well, test data is always a challenge, and if you have APIs to hit against or access to the database, that's a great resource. I honestly think the longevity of automation effort has to do with how well the test code is organized and what kind of abstractions are used, and whether or not when there's a failure, it's a legitimate failure. I think before you even get into test data, like that's kind of I feel like that's definitely valuable. A lot of companies, they don't deal with that issue until maybe they get a little further off the ground, but it's more of a race condition, I guess. But I think really the successful companies, the successful implementations I've seen they're using like page classes. They're using good abstractions like page objects for representing features in their application. And they have really helpful failure outputs, like HTML reports with screenshots and good debugging information when things go wrong, so that when there is a failure, they can look at it and discern what the issue is pretty quickly. And just basically getting whatever tools are necessary to not only make sure that the test can do what it's designed to do, but that when it fails, people trust it. If it's not trustworthy, that they can look into it and try to make it trustworthy.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that stuff, like you mentioned, it's really important. And sometimes the folks that you're reporting back to, either the project manager programs or whatever, or the more business-oriented folks, they don't understand why you need sometimes a moderately significant amount of time to evolve that stuff. But then you start bringing this in, and you mentioned something trustworthy, right? If those people can't feel, or the team as a whole really can't feel that you've got trustworthy tests that are stable and that you're getting that useful information back, you get in that trust deficit. That's a hard hole to get out of.
Yeah, it's a fairly substantial hole to get out of. Like if you have email notifications and there's just a rule to put them in a folder that no one looks at, then that's kind of it's really challenging. So, and I honestly think the other thing is just having really targeted tests. Like we talked a little bit about a feedback loop. At least maybe it was on one of your earlier slides, but I think the other thing in realizing what the effort of automation is for is not for you to run your tests on your local machine. It's for you to plug this into some sort of automated feedback loop that can notify people when there's an issue.
Right.
I think that's the other piece to this that really is imperative for building a successful automation cycle. Some sort of continuous integration, something like if you're going open source, something like Jenkins perhaps, that makes it very easy to take your automated tests and just plug them into a system that runs hands-free. And ideally, not just on a schedule, but maybe like driven based on some event, like when code's committed and your developer's tests run successfully and deploys to a test environment, then your tests run, and then everybody gets the all clear, and then it's just one of those things that just works. You're basically creating an ecosystem of feedback.
Yeah, Matt Barcombe, a pal of mine, put something into words that I've long thought, but I had never thought this concisely about. And he said, and maybe this comes from someone else, but you need to have the mindset that your build process is your first most valuable feature on any system. And he was talking about that same thing, right? The developers do a number of things. You've got some tests written around that. You check into code or you check into source control and stuff just happens. Like you mentioned, Jenkins picks that up, runs through. And when you can get that smooth process going, that's demonstrating and building all of that trust, because everyone around that project knows, oh, okay, we got a notification that we've pushed to QA or we've pushed to pre-production, and we know that the developer level unit tests ran, the integration tests ran, the UI tests ran. So we've got this baseline of information that we feel comfortable with the state. And when that happens, automatically, like you said, wow, that's big stuff there.
Yeah, it's powerful when it works, and then it's just a matter of making sure everybody cares. Like, the best way I found to make it work is when there's a failure, you make it so like nobody can commit code until it's fixed. Like, if something's broken, everybody stop productivity from occurring, because then everybody will have to fix it. Like,
right.
It's kind of like the lean like Toyota model.
Yeah, and that's another very interesting kind of cultural shift about, how software delivery has been viewed in the past, right? Things tend to be very stovepiped because, I'm developer complete. I'm going to pitch it over to QA and I'm going to work on my next task. But like you say, if we're thinking the whole team owns that green light of it's up and running in whatever environment, when that light changes to red, everybody stops, fix the problem. Everybody knows what the problem, everybody then understands what the solution was, and everybody learns from that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and this goes back, I think, to your earlier anecdote. There was one person who knew exactly what was going on in that application, and the point you're just making now is that, like, having a shared understanding of what's going on within the system is like, that's like something that really money can't buy. Ultimately, it's a very big cultural thing, and so if you could get that, then that's pretty tremendous as well. Because if one person knows and they leave the company, then nobody knows, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's a harsh place, and that happens unfortunately all the time in many industries, right? But in our role as knowledge workers, that's really tough. And then you've got that's an even deeper hole to dig out of. So that feedback, that knowledge sharing, and then making everybody on that team passionate of, oh man, the build's broken, we didn't deploy, let's all jump on this, and things get fixed quickly. That's exciting when a team gets to that point. It takes a while, takes a lot of change, but that's a very cool spot. So we're kind of drawing down to the end of the regular session. Actually, we've gone over a little bit. We still got some time for Q&A, but I do want to point out a pretty exciting event that Telerik is hosting. If you're in the Boston area, May 3rd to 5th, Telerik.next is a really awesome conference that's being put on. There's some testing stuff, there's some development stuff, there's some ALM stuff. Have a look at TelerikNext.com, but you should definitely take advantage of that if you're in the area. So I'd like to give a big thanks, first off, to all the attendees for coming in, but also to Dave for... I have no idea what time it is over there in Israel, but it shouldn't be too late. I don't think you're up in the middle of the night doing this, but thanks for joining in.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
No, it's only 5 p.m., so it's not a big deal.
Okay. Very cool. So we've got a number of questions. If you want to hang around, speaking both to Dave and to the audience, I'll spend about 5 minutes going through some of the Q&A. Do remember that, as I said, I will put up a blog post next week at some point on blogs.telerik.com. But again, thank you everyone for joining, and do remember that we have recorded the session, so there'll be some links coming around for that, and then also the white paper that I spoke of. Let's see here. Let me have a look through. Oh, we did have some questions about some of the links here, so let me go back on slides here. So the first one there is Mastering Essentials. That's the bit.ly link to the blog series. Hopefully, the screen is not showing all my GoToMeeting stuff here, and you can see the full. Okay, good. All right. There's a good point here. So this is a great cultural piece here. Some companies think that automation will make development results better. Not actually true, because you can't test in quality. So this is a personal beef of mine. There's no such thing as a quality assurance department. Testers don't assure any quality. The whole team does. And I think that's an important mindset there as well. Dave, there are a couple people who asked about those 8 concepts. So, Dave, gosh, I'm a knucklehead. Could you please let the attendees know what your 2 books are that you've written?
Oh, sure. The Selenium Guidebook, there's 2 versions of it. There's one written in Ruby, which is my recommendation for people that are just getting started with programming. But I also recently learned Java and wrote a Java version of my book. And I have now, being on the other side of it, I have to say it's not that bad. So if you're also new to programming and Java is the preferred choice of language for you and your team, then maybe that's a good option as well. The concepts are in the book, and actually there's free samples, which this chapter is included. So if you go to seleniumguidebook.com, and then if you scroll down the page, I think it's like halfway down the page, there's a little email form, and you toss in your email, and then you'll get emailed a link to download. The email will have both the free sample for the Ruby and the Java edition, so you can kind of see which one fits better for your palette, for lack of a better term. And so that's the best thing, rather than me kind of go through a bulleted list, besides which the way you refer to some concepts changes between languages, so I can't really give a completely abstract list.
Yeah. There's some questions about stressing the importance of getting the whole team involved. That's a very long discussion. I'm not trying to pimp the white paper, but I actually do talk about that both in the blog post series and the white paper. So I'd encourage you, if you're looking at ways to try to foster that whole team involvement, that would be a great starting point. And somebody said, if all else fails, bribe with food and drink. I'm all over that. There were some questions from folks if we'd be showing Test Studio. No, as you've noticed, this has been more of a discussion-based webinar. If you asked about Test Studio specifically, I will reach out to you, or someone from Telerik will via mail, because we've got your comments there. So, automation developers. Let's see here. Examples of good and bad tests. You know what, Dave? Why don't we make that the last question? Because I think it's a good one, and it sort of ties back to some of those fundamentals that you were talking about as well, when you're trying to focus on valuable tests. So for me, bad ones are pretty easy. A lot of people think UI automation is a great way to test sort of the look and feel, and I'm big on rarely ever testing things like style or layout. Instead, I want to focus on functionality versus how something looks. How do you view good versus bad?
Oh man, so I think there's way too many permutations of bad. So
you have 3 minutes. Go.
Okay, so I'll talk about good. So some of the elements of good tests. I think the top 3. A good test should be concise. It should test something very specific. Some people call that just atomic. So a test ideally should be testing one thing, and then each test should be able to be run independently. So each test should be autonomous, so that there's a whole lot of thought that goes into why. So which is also covered in my books and in my blog and all that. But basically, it just sets you up for scalability. Just trust me. And then the third one is the test should be descriptive. It should have a helpful name, or if you're using behavior-driven development, it communicates clearly the intent and the outcome. So you'd have, ideally, a very concise test that's well-named that can be run by itself, regardless of the setup data you're doing and all the teardown and all that kind of stuff. And really, that's just to exercise functionality in the app, and you would basically, step through the app and then make sure that the outcome you wanted worked. Now, to your point, like visual testing or not, like that, what I just described is very specific to testing the app, not look and feel. However, visual testing is, I've spent a lot of time researching this in the last few months, and I think that there has been a huge shift in automated visual testing that is worth paying attention to. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, then you would have gotten some of these write-ups. But there's a company called Applitools. It's based in Israel. It's Applitools. And they're a provider that helps do visual testing really well. But the reason I mention them is on their blog is where these posts I wrote live. And there is a write-up of all of the open source solutions that are available, and a lot of the, like, how to get started with some examples, and then also some of the false positives that you run into, as well as some ways to mitigate the false positives. And it's just fascinating because you can take if you start down the path of automation and you end up with some Selenium tests, you can very easily nowadays add visual testing to your tests and test the visual layout and find all kinds of really interesting bugs that you would probably miss, even doing manual testing and seeing it with your own eyes. Fascinating.
That is, and I do remember, a couple of those newsletters coming across, and quite frankly, I was just so swamped I didn't have time to chase that down. So thank you for bringing that back up, because you've highlighted something that's important not only for testers, but really anybody in software. And it's like you can't afford to get stuck in a rut and hold the same concepts for too long, because somebody will figure out how to solve that big problem that you've been ignoring for a long time. So it behooves you to keep an ear to the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully that's helpful for folks. I see more and more companies using it, and it's really the one takeaway I'd like to, if I have time, if you'll indulge me.
Absolutely.
The one tidbit I think is really important is when we're talking about these functional tests that maybe assert one thing, that's all you're doing. You're just checking one outcome. When you do visual testing, you're effectively doing hundreds of assertions because it's doing image comparison. It's hundreds of assertions, and it's like a couple lines of code you add to your test. It just blows my mind every time I think about it, because I think more people, the companies that do it, are like really blown away by it, and it's really making a huge improvement in their automated practice for very little effort.
That's very cool. You actually got me excited about that, so I'm going to go dig into that.
Okay, great.
So we're at 10:46 Eastern Time. We've hit our allocated spot. Dave, thank you again for all of the great info. And to all the attendees, thank you so much for all of your time. With that, I think we'll sign off. Again, Dave, thanks, and safe journeys.
Thank you, and thanks for organizing, and thanks everybody for attending.
All right, everyone, that's it. Look for follow-ups on this, and have a great day.